8 years, $400 million, lasted only 2 weeks, selling only 25,000 copies, making only $1 million. Now is considered one of the biggest video game failures of all time. That game was Concord. For my stance on Concord, and I know this is stuff everyone talked about a year ago, but for my take on Concord was, one thing I would definitely admit is the game itself was very well made. The graphics were good, the audio was good, I personally thought the UI looked really nice, the game was very well built, it was optimized, it ran smoothly, I didn't really hear anybody complain about optimization or feeling like you need to get some kind of supercomputer with DLSS or anything just to run the game smoothly. So technical wise and mechanical wise, the game was very well built. With that said, the issue of Concord, in my opinion, it had some fundamental problems with it. So as for the issues with Concord, I personally think there's several big ones. So first start with Concord, I think one of the big issues was its writing and tone. For Concord, I do understand that the game did have its start in 2016, was when development for Concord started. And during the 2010s, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was in its golden age. Each Marvel film that came out was one banger after another, and also the fact that around this time, what is colloquially referred to as Marvel humor, with the unironic, insincere tone, the constant quips, was popular. And hence, the writers for Concord decided to take a lot of inspiration from Guardians of the Galaxy for the tone of Concord. And for the aesthetics, they actually took a lot of inspiration from classic sci-fi art from like the 70s through like the 90s. However, looking at the trailer for Concord, whether it's the gameplay trailer or even that one cinematic trailer they had, and how I felt watching the cinematic trailer, to me, it just felt like a ripoff of Guardians of the Galaxy, honestly. Or at least it just felt very dated. Like, again, like what I said, because this game was written back in 2016, if this game did come out in 2016, it probably would have been received far better. Because I kind of personally felt a lot of people were starting to kind of get tired of that whole writing style and tone of like nothing taking itself seriously, everything being ironic, the constant quips. I think everyone honestly kind of started getting tired of that back in like 2019 through 2021. And as for Marvel, on top of that, I also know everyone's starting to kind of just get tired of the whole superhero genre where people are just kind of feeling fatigued. Kind of like how people in the 80s probably felt about Westerns. That's why I think the writing and the tone was just one of the things that just wrecked Concord, because even watching a cinematic trailer myself, I was just like cringing the whole time. And on top of that, I was just looking at the comments and everyone was just saying the same thing, saying things like, well, this isn't Guardians of the Galaxy, this is Protectors of the Cosmos, or the meme of, we got Guardians of the Galaxy at home. A bigger issue, Concord, was the fact that they were charging $40 for what amounts to a live service 5v5 hero shooter, when it's in a crowded genre where its competition is not only has more players, but is far more polished, stands out much more, and on top of it, they're free. Meaning right now, you could just download Overwatch, you can download Valorant, you can download Marvel Rivals, and Concord, you had to pay $40 to play what amounts to basically a very watered down, generic hero shooter. And also I think on top of that, with the reveal trailer, a lot of people I think kind of felt a bit misled, where it didn't really say this was going to be a hero shooter till like the last minute. Where we watched this whole trailer, we're thinking, okay, yeah, looks a bit like a Guardians of the Galaxy ripoff, but hey, maybe it might be like a cool adventure game. Or maybe like a co-op extraction shooter. Nope, it's a hero shooter that looks like it belongs in 2016. Hence why I think the big problem with Concord was because it was trying to be a hero shooter, when in reality it was just very bland, generic, and just boring. And its competitors, like Marvel Rivals, which was a game that came out around its time, Overwatch, Team Fortress 2, Valorant, Apex Legends, were games that were not only vastly superior to Concord, but also free. Meaning you could right now play these games without spending a single dollar. Concord was $40. So I think one large issue, and I think this is probably the issue with Concord to a lot of people, was the character design was just atrocious. And I'm not coming from one of those like anti-woke YouTubers who are like having a meltdown because the game had pronouns or the female characters aren't like sexualized at all, but even art designers were like, what is this? because Concord unfortunately breaks a lot of the rules of character design and also character design for hero shooters, where you have strong silhouettes. The character's look is based on what their sort of niche is. And I think the one game that does do this very well is Team Fortress 2, where each of the characters has their own silhouette. The character's looks sort of tells you what they're about. For example, the Scout, he's very fast, and he's like a little slim build. Or Tracer from Overwatch, she's like a fast, I think it's like, I know she's kind of like an analog for Scout from TF2, but in a sense she's fast, hence why she's skinny. Or if you got a tank build, they're like, big, bulky. But unfortunately for Concord, you look at half the characters, and besides for the fact that the character designs would just stick out for all the wrong reasons, they also just look very generic, unappealing. And I think the big issue is, you take a look at him and you're like, well, what does this person do? And I think a good example is like, you got this like one fat, like I guess Hawaiian or Mexican dude named Doll or something, who's a healer. But looking at him, I'm like, okay, yeah, he's got goggles, but I don't see nothing on him that says health. At least with Mercy from Overwatch, she has like an angelic build. She's a healer. Or better yet, the medic from TF2, where, he's dressed like a doctor. But with Doll, I think that's his name, nothing about him screams medic. Or you look at this one character who's apparently, I think it's like that black woman with like the pink afro, who's like a stealth melee build. Nothing about her screams, oh, I sneak around with a knife. She looks like someone going to a nightclub in 1975. And I think that's a big issue of these characters just look very like, they don't fit in for a hero shooter. They look like NPCs from a video game, or they look like they don't belong in a hero shooter. Like, you look at them, you're like, okay, these just look like people that are just wearing costumes. Or you got the big vacuum robot. I don't know what they do. And that's why I think it's like the big issue with the character design is like generally in other games, like I think in my opinion TF2 does the best at this, but Overwatch also does a really good job at this, is you, at least when you see the characters, like what they're about, or what their sort of like play style for a game is. So okay, this person's a medic build because of X, Y, and Z. This person's a tank. This person's a ranger. This person's like a defense person. And personally, I think TF2 does like a really good job at this, and I think it's like the GOAT for this. But I also know Overwatch does a very good job at this. But with Concord, you look at all the characters and you're like, I don't know who any of these people are, what they do. I think the saddest thing with Concord was how much high hopes Sony had for this game. But the fact that Sony sunk almost $500 million into this, which basically $400 million Sony spent on this game. The company, Firebreak Studios, was working on this game for nearly a decade, and that Sony thought that Concord was going to be their new flagship IP. This was going to be the big IP that was going to generate them billions of dollars, and it was going to be the next live service juggernaut. But unfortunately, when the game got revealed, it seemed like nobody cared. There was a cinematic trailer, everyone just looked at it like it was a Guardians of the Galaxy ripoff. Even if people were interested, I think they kind of got very disappointed when they heard that the game was going to be a 5 versus 5 hero shooter. And yeah, apparently when the open beta dropped, there wasn't even 1,000 people playing it. And then the game released, hardly anybody, I think it was like only 25,000 copies sold. And again, that was like the sad thing, how Sony had like apparently immensely high hopes for this game. Turns out this game now will be considered one of the biggest flops in history, except for maybe E.T. for the Atari. A game so bad that they got all the copies and buried it in the desert, which apparently a couple years ago they actually did find where they buried the copies at, and I think it was like Arizona or New Mexico. And also the fact that Sony actually refunded everybody who bought Concord, all 25,000 people, I think, if even. And I think the sad thing about Concord was Concord as a game product itself, meaning like for the actual function, the programming, the design, was very well built. Meaning the developers at Firebreak did a phenomenal job building the game with what they had. The problem was the game's direction, because unfortunately what ended up happening with Concord was it proved to be basically a very generic, very bland. It had really nothing to offer it to stand out from other more competent, more better hero shooters. Since again, Concord was a very competently built product, meaning the developers did a good job with what they had. But I felt like the big issue with Concord was its direction, or whoever designed the game. Not down to like the individual programmers, the like engineers, but who was the one who was saying, oh, this feature looks cool, this feature looks cool, oh, we should write it like this. or design it like that. What I'm trying to say is, like, the higher ups I felt like were the ones that were the problem. And I did hear somewhere that the company did have issues with like toxic positivity, where Firebreak and Sony would get upset if somebody brings up blaring issues to the game, because again, they had immensely high hopes for this game. But ultimately, I think the saddest thing is, like, since I saw Concord, the developers did a great job with what they had, but now Firebreak has been shut down, and all the higher ups just bounce ship to other places. One's got moved back to Sony. I think one person now works for EA, and I'm now wondering, like, well, where's all the developers? Since the developers did a great job with what they had, but I just wonder, did they just get laid off? Did they get fired? I'm hoping that they were able to jump ship and now we're working at a different company, but who knows? Whereas all the executives basically just jump ships to other places. Like, the sad thing with Concord is, I think it was forgettable. It's like, yeah, everyone knew about how much of a disaster the game was at launch, because the game only lasted 2 weeks before Sony just shuttered it and probably wrote it off under taxes. But other than that, Concord was just bland, forgettable. There was no, like, compilation of just horrifying game-breaking glitches. It was just a bland, forgettable game. And it's not going to be, unfortunately, going down in history like E.T. for the Atari was, Red Hell Retribution, Redfield, Mind's Eye, which are bad games, whereas Concord was just forgettable. And I think that's the saddest thing about the game, because it was, and I think that's just the thing with Concord. That's really going to be remembered as the biggest launch failure in history.